October 1944. A fortified village near Chateau-Salins, France. Mud clings to the boots of young infantrymen waiting behind a low stone ridge. Across 500 yards of completely open ground lies a heavily defended German position. Machine gun nests cover every inch of the grass. A local civilian points to a heavy iron grate hidden under brush, offering a completely safe, subterranean path into the heart of the enemy stronghold. The commanding officer stares at the diagram in his leather map case, shakes his head, and orders his men to charge directly into the open field instead. 16 American soldiers die in a hail of lead within 20 minutes. General George S. Patton will soon confront this commander and force him to experience the exact tactical reality he chose to ignore because of a book. This is the story of an infantry company commander who valued bureaucratic doctrine over human life, and the legendary general who taught him a permanent lesson in reality. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old military hierarchies met new tactical realities on the bloody battlefields of Europe. Henri Dubois was 52 years old and had lived in that small French valley his entire life. He was a farmer who knew every ditch, every cellar, and every hidden stone passage connecting the ancient barns of his village. During the bitter years of the German occupation, he had risked his life daily to smuggle bread and meat past enemy patrols, using a network of forgotten stone drainage tunnels beneath the pastures. He had lost his oldest son to a firing squad and his home to artillery fire, leaving him with nothing but an intimate, blood-bought knowledge of the local soil. When the American lines finally reached his fields, he walked directly to the command tent, eager to offer his secret pathways to save the lives of the young men who had come to liberate his home. Instead, he found himself staring into the cold eyes of an officer who saw him only as an ignorant peasant interfering with military affairs. Captain Gerald Thornton was 32 years old, hailed from West Point, New York, and commanded the infantry company tasked with taking the village. He was a man shaped entirely by rigid institutions, possessing a flawless academic record and an unshakable belief in bureaucratic perfection. His uniform was immaculate, his boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the thick French mud, and he carried a pristine copy of Field Manual 7-10 inside his leather map case at all times. To Thornton, war was not a chaotic struggle of flesh and mud, but a series of mathematical equations solved by textbook doctrine. He frequently quoted specific sub-paragraphs during morning briefings and openly despised any tactical improvisation that lacked official Washington approval. When the local farmer explained how the subterranean drainage tunnels could bypass the German machine guns completely, the captain smiled with supreme academic arrogance and tapped the cover of his booklet, declaring that if a maneuver was not printed in the manual, it did not exist in the United States Army. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had slowed from a rapid sprint into a grueling, bloody crawl. The dense hedgerows of Normandy were gone, replaced by ancient, stone-built French villages that the retreating German army converted into formidable fortresses. Every cellar became a concrete bunker. Every church tower housed an artillery spotter, and every open field was transformed into a pre-registered kill zone for heavy machine guns. American supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of miles of newly liberated territory, leaving frontline units chronically short on fuel, heavy artillery ammunition, and fresh replacements. In this environment of scarcity and stubborn enemy resistance, junior officers on the ground were forced to carry an immense burden of tactical decision-making, often without direct oversight from higher headquarters. Many field commanders quickly learned that survival required absolute flexibility, prompting them to bend regulations, utilize captured weapons, and rely heavily on the intelligence provided by local resistance fighters. Higher-ranking officers frequently turned a blind eye to these unorthodox methods, understanding that a secured objective was far more valuable than strict adherence to administrative protocols. However, the pressure of command affected men differently, driving some to rely entirely on institutional dogmas as a shield against the terrifying unpredictability of the front lines. They treated official army publications not as flexible guidelines for a chaotic battlefield, but as infallible scripture designed to protect them from failure. This rigid mindset created a dangerous disconnect between the theoretical battles devised by bureaucrats in Washington and the brutal, mud-splattered realities of the European theater. The stage was set for a disaster where textbook theory collided directly with geographic reality. First, Lieutenant Thomas Miller, the company executive officer, walked into the command tent with a muddy map. Captain Thornton was scraping dried dirt from his leather boots with a silver pocket knife. Miller dropped his helmet onto a wooden crate and pointed out the open tent flap toward the fortified village. He explained that a local scout had found a completely clear route. The underground stone drainage passages were tall enough for a man to walk through. They could put an entire platoon directly behind the German machine gun positions without drawing a single shot. Captain Thornton did not look up from his boot. He asked if the lieutenant had consulted Field Manual 710. Miller said there was no time for reading. The open field was a slaughterhouse. Thornton stood up and opened his map case. He pulled out the pristine, olive-drab booklet and laid it flat on the folding table. He tapped a finger on the page covering infantry rifle company offenses. He stated that the doctrine was incredibly clear. The manual prescribed a base of fire, a maneuver element, and an assault element across the terrain. Miller stepped closer to the table and argued that the terrain outside was completely flat grass with zero cover. The maneuver element would be cut to pieces before they advanced 50 yards. He begged the captain to listen to the French farmer, who had used the tunnels for years. Thornton closed the booklet with a sharp snap. He said, "The United States Army did not base its tactical movements on the gossip of foreign peasants." He stated that the manual had been tested for decades by the finest military minds in America. If the authors of the doctrine had intended for an infantry company to crawl through drainage ditches, they would have included a chapter on subterranean infiltration. He declared that if it was not written in the manual, they simply would not do it. Miller asked if the captain was seriously going to risk his men on an open charge just to follow a printed page. Thornton adjusted his collar and said his rank exceeded the lieutenant's judgment. He ordered the company to form up for a standard daylight assault across the pasture exactly as prescribed by the regulations. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes. The German machine guns opened fire. The moment the leading platoon cleared the stone ridge, 16 American soldiers were killed in the grass, their bodies pinned down in the mud because there was no cover to advance and no way to retreat. A reconnaissance patrol later confirmed the drainage tunnels were completely empty and perfectly usable. The tragic report detailing the needless massacre reached General Patton's headquarters within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up to the command tent, kicking up thick sprays of dark mud. The 4 silver stars on his helmet gleamed against the gray, overcast sky, and the ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily on his belt. The entire camp fell into a sudden, dead silence as his boots hit the ground. He walked into the tent unannounced, his presence instantly freezing the officers inside. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was incredibly cold. Patton looked directly at the company commander and asked how many men were lost in the morning assault. Thornton stood at rigid attention and stated that 16 men were killed crossing the field. Patton asked if a local civilian had offered a clear route through underground passages before the attack. Thornton replied that a Frenchman had mentioned some drainage ditches, but they were completely unofficial. Patton asked if the captain had refused to look at the tunnels because they were not listed in the tactical publications. Thornton stated that he had followed Field Manual 7-10 down to the exact paragraph because Army regulations were absolute. Patton studied the captain for a long moment. He said that the manual was written as a guide to teach men how to think, not to think for them. He noted that he had personally helped author sections of the very booklet Thornton carried in his map case. The text explicitly commanded officers to adapt their maneuvers to the local terrain. And those underground tunnels were part of the terrain. Thornton had ignored the physical reality of the earth to worship a printed page, treating a tactical pamphlet like a holy religion instead of a practical tool. Patton stated that a commander who stops thinking has no right to order American soldiers into battle. He noted that 16 men were dead because their captain possessed a rank that far exceeded his actual judgment. The general declared that military doctrine was designed to defeat the enemy, not to provide an arrogant officer with a bureaucratic excuse for a slaughter. He gave the captain two options. Thornton could either strip off his captain bars right now and lead the next assault platoon through those exact underground tunnels, or he could face an immediate court-martial for criminal negligence. Thornton grew completely pale, his polished boots trembling slightly against the dirt floor, as he whispered that he would comply with the order. The punishment was carried out on the very same afternoon before the entire company. First Lieutenant Miller supervised the gathering, assembling the remaining men in a silent line along the edge of the muddy pasture. Captain Thornton stood at the head of the detachment, his immaculate uniform now stripped of its silver rank insignia, leaving only dark patches on his collar where his authority used to rest. He held a heavy trench lantern in one hand and a standard issue entrenching tool in the other, his polished leather boots sinking into the wet earth near the opening of the subterranean drainage passage. The cold air carried the heavy metallic stench of cordite from the nearby battlefield, and the damp, rotting smell of ancient moss rising from the darkness below. The surviving soldiers watched with grim, unblinking expressions as their former commander bent down and crawled directly into the stone tunnel, forcing his frame into the tight, black spaces he had previously claimed did not exist. He was forced to lead the advance squad through hundreds of yards of freezing slime, feeling the oppressive weight of the stone ceiling just inches above his neck. They emerged directly behind the enemy lines, entering the fortified village completely unseen and capturing the German machine gun nests without losing a single man. Henry Dubois returned to his quiet pastures after the German surrender, spending his remaining years rebuilding the stone barn that artillery fire had leveled. He never spoke publicly about the daylight assault across his fields, but local neighbors noted that he kept a copy of an American infantry patch mounted over his hearth until his death in 1972. The village underground drainage network remained completely intact, preserved by the community as a silent monument to the 16 men who never had the chance to use it. Gerald Thornton spent the remainder of the European campaign reassigned to a rear area administrative depot in eastern France, overseeing the sorting of supply manifests far from the combat lines. He returned to New York after the demobilization of 1946, working as a middle management clerk for a railway corporation where he strictly enforced corporate timetables until his retirement. He remained deeply bitter about his wartime service, frequently telling his close relatives that uneducated battlefield improvisation had ruined the precise science of modern military operations. He died quietly in 1985, leaving behind a trunk of immaculate uniforms and a heavily annotated tactical handbook. General Patton never recorded the incident in his official command diaries, keeping the operational reports filed away in his personal correspondence drawers. He briefly mentioned the tactical failure in a private letter to his spouse later that winter, noting that a map can show an officer the slope of a hill, but it can never give him the wisdom to see what lies beneath the grass. Some historians have argued that the relief of a West Point graduate under such circumstances was an unnecessary destruction of a promising officer's career during a critical manpower shortage. They point out that maintaining strict chain of command and adhering to official doctrine was the only way to prevent widespread chaos among thousands of raw, inexperienced replacement troops flooding the front lines. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the ruthless elimination of bureaucratic arrogance was entirely necessary to force field commanders to value geographic reality over administrative compliance. What is certain is that the tactical maneuver through the subterranean network successfully secured the position with absolutely zero further loss of American life. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand instead? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.